New York Times article that appeared in May of this year, which denounces the pervasiveness and persistence of anti-Semitism in contemporary times, citing the findings of an unprecedented global survey carried out by the US Anti-Defamation League between September 2013 and February 2014, according to which 26% of the world's adult population still harbors anti-Semitic attitudes, and some 35% of the interviewees have not heard of the Holocaust. Among these, 9% of the US respondents were found anti-Semitic, 25% of people from Western Europe, and 34% from Eastern Europe, with the case of Romania being at a level of 35%, that of Moldova at 30%, and faring a bit better than those of neighboring countries. It is also relevant to note that among the 11 sentences containing anti-Semitic stereotypes tested on respondents, the survey showed that the most widely held stereotype was an affirmative answer to the statement that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to this country or the countries they live in, which was held by 41% of the people. And the second most widely accepted stereotype was that Jews have too much power in the business world, which was answered in the affirmative by 35%. In the case of Eastern Europe, the situation is a bit different in the sense that the most widely accepted stereotype is this latter, that Jews have too much power in the business world, which was held by 53% of the interviewed people, followed by another economic-based stereotype, which was Jews have too much power among international financial markets, which was held by 48% of respondents. Using as point of departure these contemporary findings in which economic competition seems to remain the main factor for lingering anti-Semitic beliefs in Eastern Europe, my paper probes into the specifics of Romanian anti-Semitism at the turn of the 20th century, as it was reflected in life stories written by Romanian Jewish immigrants to the US, analyzing the English language memoirs of two writers, Emmy and Konrad Berkovich, and one Hollywood actor, the last one, Edward G. Robinson. It would also be interesting to note the case of Morris Samuel, but because I don't have time, I won't go into that, because Morris Samuel left Romania at 5 years old. He's not so much interested into the anti-Semitic discriminatory laws that were held in Romania, but much more interested in the shtetl-like atmosphere that was transmitted to him by his family members. Now, all the authors that I consider were actually born at the close of the 19th century. I've got the place in JFR's in the table. But published their memoirs at different moments in time, ranging from 1917, the year of the initial publication of Ravages in America in the Making, to 1973, which was the year when Edward G. Robinson's All My Yesterdays appeared, jointly written with Leonard Spiegelglass. Between these two outward chronological parameters, Konrad Berkovich's publication of It's the Gypsy in Me, the autobiography of Konrad Berkovich, occurred in the early days of the Second World War in 1941. The spread of publication timelines can permit us to see how the historical context of publication may more or less determine different textual emphasis and points of anti-Semitic feelings of these authors. Additionally, given the fact that they left Romania at different ages and from different regions, and you can see that Ravage and Berkovich were in Moldova, Ravage born in Berlad, basically living in Vaslui for the rest of the time he spent in Romania, and Berkovich moving between Galați and Brăila, whereas Robinson was born in Bucharest. And I believe that this can see the way in which age on departure or place of residence might have also determined a different positioning vis-à-vis Romanian anti-Semitism. Just as a case of giving you an insight into when they left, Berkovich was the first to leave in 1896 at 15 years old, and first spent some time in France, only arriving in the US in 1904. Ravage was leaving Romania in 1900 at age 16 and went directly to New York, and Edward G. Robinson left at 10 years old in 1903 and again went directly to New York. In her 2004 book on Romanian Jewish intellectuals in the 19th century, Simona Farcășan thoroughly elaborates on the international context and specifics of Romanian anti-Semitism in the late 19th century, noting how this was the era of the rise of modern anti-Semitism, whose main feature was the backgrounding of Enlightenment ideas by Romanticism, a movement associated with the crystallization of the national identity idea, where religion was no longer seen in universal terms, but in conjunction with particular ethno-national characteristics. According to historical romanticism, the nation was defined as an ethnic-based community with a common language and religion, as well as specific traditions separating it from all the other nations. As a result, the anti-Semitism fostered by this new mode of thinking foregrounded the Jews' incompatibility with the national character of the various environments in which they resided by the extreme politicization of anti-Jewish hatred, making Jews responsible for many situations of crisis, and channeling especially the poor majority's resentment and discontent towards the Jewish scapegoat by appealing to the affected emotions of average masses. For Romanian politicians, the internalization of the stereotype of the Jew as a bloodsucker of the nation, which soon became the dominant mindset of average Romanians, represented a manipulative strategy serving their immediate gain, that of detouring people's attention from the real problems of the Romanian society and the actual causes and responsible bodies. In what follows, I'm going to examine the guise of such forms of official and popular anti-Semitism in Romania as depicted in life stories written by Jews who immigrated to the US at the end of the 19th century and who wrote their memoirs in English, having a clear American audience in mind and also trying to show to this the reasons for leaving their country behind in a context in which the anti-immigration laws of America started to be created. These authors were part of the great emigration movement of Jews from Romania, which started in 1882, especially in response to increasingly poor economic and political conditions. Samuel Joseph's 1914 PhD dissertation in political science at Columbia University, Jewish Immigration in the US from 1881 to 1910, includes the statistics with the figures of Romanian Jews growing wave of emigration. And the first one you have on the slide notes how between 1881 and 1910 there were around 67,000 Romanian Jews coming to the US, with a mere 7,000 in the first decade, something like 12,000 to 13,000 between 1891 and 1900, and the bulk of them between 1901 and 1910, when 47,300 Jews emigrated, which represented the climax moment, largely due to the resumption of the government program against the Jews. The other table is relevant if you just look at the very last column, because it shows that in the case of Romania, Jews represented the main people that were leaving. They represented 90% of the total of immigrants coming to the United States, as opposed to Russia, where you had Jews representing 50% of the total number of immigrants to the US, and Austria-Hungary, where you had something like 25% of the whole population being Jewish. Even if written over a quite long time span, the life stories of the three authors I will consider are indisputably united by the fact that all their texts discuss Jewish life in Romania in the last decade of the 19th century. Ravage's memoir, the earliest one published and one which was soon used as a history textbook in American high schools, suggested the discriminatory context of Romania indirectly by invoking the myth of America as the promised land upon the return of his cousin, not coincidentally called Cuza, from the United States, and noting there was a country somewhere beyond seas where a man was a man in spite of his religion and his origin. In celebrating America's embrace of human equality, the author implies the correlating absence of this right in Romania, where religious and ethnic discrimination persisted. A few pages later, this abstract presentation of the situation is sustained by a series of concrete illustrations centered around what Ravage calls the discriminations of the government against us, which amount to the enumeration of all sorts of restrictions aimed at the Jew, which you have on the very first quote on this slide. And they basically deal with the impossibility of following the law profession, medicine, traditional Jewish education, and the 1867 laws about restrictions of living in villages as far as Jews were concerned, or innkeeping or restaurant keeping. Ravage was not alone in decrying such practices. In the following quote, which you have from Robinson's memoir, he gave equal voice to Romania's persecutory atmosphere, also primarily in relation to official anti-Semitic measures, especially with regard to citizenship and political rights. He emphasized that Jews were not recognized as Romanian citizens, notwithstanding having lived in Romania for several generations. He remarked, for instance, that his maternal grandmother was born in the 1830s of Romanian-born parents and grandparents, yet according to Romanian law, she was designated as a foreigner. In making this latter claim, Robinson was following in the footsteps of Romanian Jewish intellectuals in the second half of the 19th century, who especially through Revista Israelita and the Yudovarash Historical Society started to unearth and publish documents about the early beginnings of the Jewish presence on the Romanian territories, so as to dispute the antro-theory of the time's Romanian historians that sustained the late arrival of Jews in this area as an argument for their not being granted equal rights. The repressive atmosphere depicted by Robinson and Ravage actually mirrored the legal situation of Romanian Jews from the period after the Congress of Berlin in 1878 until after the First World War. Throughout these decades, there was a proliferation of discriminatory laws in Romania that were specifically aimed at Jews. In response, attempts to alter the pattern of anti-Jewish discrimination were carried out by Western European interventions at the Congress of Berlin, which imposed the modification of Article 7 of the Romanian Constitution, the one that dealt with citizenship, and which partly explains this author's praise of immigration to the West and their admiration of the West prior to getting there. This was because the 1866 Constitution stipulated that only Christian foreigners could become Romanian citizens, after the initial promise to emancipate the Jews and offer equal rights to all, first sustained during the 1848 Revolution, then by Cousin in his 1868 Project for the Civil Code, and later by senators and deputies during the May 1866 visit of Adolphe Crémieux, former French Minister of Justice and President of Alliance Israélite Universelle, the newly formed Association for the Defense of Jewish Rights in the World. Crémieux's address to the Romanian Parliament, pleading for the guarantee of freedom of consciousness and religious equality in the new constitution, was received with heartfelt applause and support, but was then overturned in the following House meetings from June 1866. Therefore, even if they had lived on Romanian territory for a long time, Jews could not benefit from political rights, especially on the grounds of their religious belief. In response, in 1878, the Congress of Berlin imposed the modification of this Article 7 of the Romanian Constitution as a prerequisite to recognizing Romania's independence. The article was indeed modified in 1879, granting the possibility that non-Christian aliens could become Romanian citizens, but only by individual naturalization, and after staying for 10 more years in the country and proving their utility for that, which in turn marked the beginning of subsidiary tolerance. Thus, Article 7 left unsolved the judicial status of the Jewish community, and documents show that individual naturalization was a slow process, with only 109 Jews getting Romanian citizenship from 1879 to 1903, if one does not count the 883 combatants in the working countries. Given this, the Western insistence that Romanian independence only be recognized after the authorities had granted Jewish emancipation led to the subsequent proliferation of restrictive legislative provisions, like the ones mentioned by Ravage and Robinson, caused by Romanian officials' frustration of what they considered the international powers' illegal involvement in the domestic affairs of the newly created state. The reformatory acts against such Romanian official practices had been made possible especially by the active efforts to internationalize the Jewish question in Romania due to the U.S. consul Benjamin Franklin Soto coming to Romania between January 1871 and January 1876 on a missionary work for the benefit of the people he represents, according to the letter addressed by the U.S. President Grant to the Romanian authorities in December 1870. And once here, Soto established a bilingual Romanian-German periodical, Romanische Post, meant to document the situation of Jews in Romania, edited by his secretary, who also talked about the fate of the Jews in his memoirs, Adolf Stern, and also founding the Zion Brotherhood in January 1873, an order whose aim was to assist Jews in need after the model of the U.S. order, Thy Breath, to which Soto belonged. Such actions gave rise to Romanian Jewish authors' embrace of Western ideas and their decision to emigrate that way. In response to all this, however, the intellectual and political circles of Romania resurrected their anti-Semitic xenophobic feelings, and by 1880 blamed the Jews for not only invading the country, taking hold of its subsistence means and ruining its traditions, but also for plotting with outside enemies to deter it from reaching its highest ideal, an internationally recognized Greater Romania. And perhaps the most important law to consider from this point of view is the Alien Law of 1881, in which those that were considered social or political agitators, and therefore a danger to the threat of the nation, would be immediately expelled, under which lots of Jews would be taken out of Romania. In light of such escalating anti-Semitic sentiments, but also with the accompanying unprecedented increase in the number of Eastern European Jewish immigrants towards the West, American interest in Romania's Jewish question was at its height between the 1870s and 1910s, just as British interest in Russia's Jewish question was at its height between 1890 and 1914. As a result, publications on these topics abounded in the UK and the US during this period, and they basically represented surveys of official Western attitude toward Tsarist Russia or Romania. In the case of UK and Russia, for instance, Sam Johnson has well pointed out that the publication of Darkest Russia would be the flagship publication that was going in this direction. In the US, in 1902, the American Secretary of State John Hay wrote a circular note to the great European powers that had signed the Treaty of Berlin and explained how the American government is compelled to protest against the treatment to which Jews are subjected in Romania in the name of humanity, following the principles of international law and eternal justice. Additionally, Volume 3 of the American Jewish Yearbook from 1903 was dedicated to Romania and placed it on a par with Imperial Russia in relation to its discriminatory practices against the Jews. If undertaking to compare the methods of the official apparatus in both countries, the peculiarity of Romania amounted to its duplicity of policy of hidden hostility and indirect expulsion, especially following the Alien Law of 1881, as opposed to the Tsarist authorities' more open anti-Jewish measures. As well indicated in Ravage's memoir, written during this period of high US interest in condemning Romania's policies, Romanians used veiled socio-economic anti-Jewish legislation while avoiding outward use of barbarous acts and brutality that would draw the attention and disapproval of the civilized world. In addition, Robinson's memoir refers to the Jewish community of Bucharest within the Old Kingdom, which was faring slightly better in economic terms than that of Moldova. Given his young age on emigration, he was 10 years old, Robinson chose to primarily focus on the education and discriminatory legislation that directly affected him, noting how, you have the very last quote in the slide going in this direction. He notes how new laws were being passed according to which primary education was free for Romanians only. Aliens were to pay a tuition fee and would be admitted provided that there were enough places available, following the laws of 1893 and 1896 and a previous 1887 circular by the Minister of Public Instruction, indicating that preference should be given to Romanian children in case there was not enough room in the elementary schools for all. In addition, Robinson noted how anti-Semitic propaganda was being taught at the time in Romania's public secondary schools. And just as a case in point sanctioning his ideas, one only needs to consider the sentences used for grammar practice in one of the existing textbooks from 1898, Grammar of the Romanian Language, by Emi Suchianu, an English language teacher at St. Sava and St. George High Schools in Bucharest, which ran, "Never believe a Jew when he's on the point of death," or "A Hebrew never dines until he has cheated someone." Konrad Berković's memoir completes this picture by indicating how Romania's more duplicitous policy of veiled hostility via official anti-Jewish legislation did not altogether bypass the use of physical brutality, especially in Moldova. One of the reasons of Berković's foregrounding of physical violence was undoubtedly related to the fact that his book was published in 1941, a year characterized by increased physical abuses against Jews by Romanian authorities in the context of the Second World War, following the massacre of Dorohoi from July 1940, the January Bucharest pogroms from 1941, and the Iași pogroms from July of 1941. Indeed, the economic depression that became dire in Romania towards the close of the 19th century was accompanied by an increased level of violence, starting with the anti-Jewish aggressive acts from Belgrade, Buzău, Botoșani, Bucharest, and Iași from 1867 until 1898. In discussing these cases, the 1901-1902 volume of the American Jewish Yearbook commented on alleged police refusal to officially interfere in order to protect the positive image of the government and state authorities by inflaming instead the peasant population against other religious and ethnic groups. What Berković's life story brings into the discussion, besides the hidden obvious official implications suggested here, is the change of attitude that such events triggered among the Romanian peasant population. In the 1890s, this could be explained by the fact that there was an internalized stereotypical image of Jews percolating in Romanian folk culture, as also shown in Andrei Oișteanu's study on Jewish images in Romanian culture, but also as contemporaneously exposed by journal editor and literary historian Moses Schwarzfeld in his book Jews in Romanian Folk Culture, Study of Folk Psychology, published in 1891 in Bucharest. He therein recorded, for instance, an 1881 Romanian peasant song, the lines of which are placed in Romanian and English translation on the slide, from Nea Vaslui, which had similar lyrics to a song performed by peasant children from Iași, in which Jews were associated with demonological imagery. In similar fashion, in his memoir, Berkovich has talked about the change of attitude in point of the peasant population of the Städel in which he lived with his family, and how they refused to remain servants to his parents after the start of violence there. And only the Turkish and the Russian help would be able to find Roma servants to help them work with the barns and the stables. But Berkovich interestingly continues all this and notes, enraged, the servants who had left us returned to beat up the gypsies. This passage powerfully records mainstream Romanian peasant responses as a form of popular anti-Semitism at the side of its official variant, as well as responses of other minority groups. In the first place, the uneducated peasants seem to internalize the manipulative strategy of the government and reconsider their situation as no longer that of employed individuals earning a living by working for other people, but as superior individuals to their former employers, whose status had been rendered inferior by their ethnic difference alone. Meanwhile, only the other minorities, whose status had not been modified by the violent outbreaks, remain honest to their former employers and try to find a way out. But in their turn, they become a target for the mainstream's attacks. Berkovich's text therefore sustains important insights available through the vulnerable lens of a minority group. This represented an opportunity to remain critically alert about persecution and to openly choose to fight it, which was the only way to supplement the partial, blind mainstream perspective of Romania. Things were actually more complicated than Berkovich represented them in this passage, since Romanian peasants were by and large ignorant, manipulated victims of official practices. This was the point sustained by Wilhelm Fildermann in his memoirs about the years 1900-1940, in which he explained how after the 1859 Union, despite some measures such as the 1864 agrarian reform, which was meant to grant some land to peasants, most of them remained landless by the beginning of the 20th century. Therefore, they had to keep working for the boyars and stay in a state of de facto semi-servitude. In the 1910s, this terrible plight of peasants was also depicted in the work of the Romanian Jewish artist Iosif Iser, whose drawings showed that both ethnic belonging and different class lines simultaneously served as a basis for the unfair practices of the Romanian mainstream political and socio-economic leaders. Two of Iser's works, which I consider particularly relevant to consider, are his 1911 Enforcing the Constitution and Cholera. The former piece shows a police officer beating a weak, skinny and naked peasant with the back of his gun. The latter depicts the image of cholera as personified by a stag-holding death figure contemplating cemetery crosses, two of them marked with the year 1907, the time of one of the most violently repressed peasant revolts in Romania. Under the drawing, cholera death's sarcastic words are written in pencil and read, "I'm no longer needed, but the got there before me." Using peasants in a position similar to that of Jews as victims of acts of persecutions and physical violence, Iser's caricatured black and white drawings create a form of social satire which exposes the victimization of the average poor Romanian citizen by authorities, either represented by the police officer, who should normally ensure law enforcement, or by political leaders like the Liberal Prime Minister Ion Brătianu, well known for his class and ethnic-based prejudices. Despite its simplification of this situation of the peasants, Berkovich's text complementarily shows how at times, unable to see the similarity of positions with other discriminated groups, the victims of an unfair policy could become themselves monstrous, sharing complicity with their potential executioners in relation to other powerless groups. Moreover, Berkovich's aim is to simultaneously record Romanian official discriminatory treatment of other minority groups in the Jewish community by drawing analogies of different moments in his memoirs between unfounded anti-Semitic violence and the pursuit of gypsies in late 19th century Romania. Starting from here, Berkovich is the only writer among those I have considered today, which explicitly furnishes the reasons for such discriminatory practices as an attempt to deflect attention from Romania's poor economic situation by inciting the masses against other ethnic groups. And he explains that the case in point for his family was that because of the alien law of 1881, in 1896 they were expelled from the country after he had put up posters throughout Brăila denouncing the pogroms. Evidently, all the authors of the investigation were well aware of the fundamental differences between American and Romanian societies. In the first place, each understood their entitlement to free speech in the US and the unthreatened opportunity to publish critical opinions without running the risk of arrest or annihilation. This was, of course, in keeping with the widespread Jewish attitude towards the US as voiced by Abraham Kahn, the celebrated editor of the Facets, the Yiddish daily forward newspaper published in New York since 1897, who celebrated America's democratic traditions, especially expressed by freedom of press, in comparison to the case of Russia. In his memoir, Edward J. Robinson also commended the freedom of press in the early 20th century US, acknowledging William Randolph Hearst's yellow reporting in the Evening Journal, which he claimed courageously attacked the trusts and interest, and continued, to a young immigrant, any journalist who had the courage to speak frankly and fearlessly about the rulers of the nation seemed courageous beyond belief. In other words, by bridging the gap between a utopian image of America and the discovery of its imperfect at times faulty character, Romanian Jews found real gains in realizing how their new location granted freedom of press and opinion, which was in contrast to the censorship and discrimination that dominated life in Eastern Europe. Likewise, in describing the downside of their new country, they simultaneously celebrated America's democratic atmosphere and promise of open critical debate, and revealed that it was the only basis for improving their imperfect society towards a fair state of affairs. As such, Romanian Jewish immigrant autobiographies rely on each author's double application of the utopian-dystopian formula, the United States versus Romania, with the former as an imperfect land of opportunity, positioned against the return to the country of one's birth, still characterized by persistent anti-Semitism and discrimination, undergirding what Joseph calls the forms of governmental pressure amounting to an expulsive force, reflected in the extraordinary rate of Jewish immigration to the US.